Welcome to the Honest Money Show. Thanks to our sponsor Bitaroo for making today's episode possible, Australia's biggest Bitcoin-only exchange. Joining me today is Steve Orenstein, the CEO of Locate Technologies. Locate is the first company in Australia to put Bitcoin on their Treasury, on their balance, and it's the first company that is ASX-listed, so listed on the Australian Stock Exchange, which, you know, is pretty special. I'm very happy to have you here today with us. Steve, welcome.
Thanks, Anja. Great to be here.
Yay. I wanted to start basically chronologically with your journey. So how long has Locate essentially been in operation for?
So originally started in 2014. I had just previously, I was running another business actually before this called Connect to Field, which was a job management and scheduling application. At the end of 2013, it got acquired by a company out of the US. And so I worked with them through the post-acquisition process, and then I was sort of, looking for what next to do, and sort of saw this opportunity in the logistics space, and that was the start of building the Zoom to You business. And so that was essentially a marketplace designed for same-day delivery across Australia. And so independent drivers having the ability to do deliveries, and doing that, whether it's the same day or whether in 3 hours or 1 hour. That sort of grew from there into our Locate to You product, which is essentially taking all the technology that we built for Zoom to You, but building it into its own product. And so for companies that have their own fleet of their own drivers, can use our software to be able to manage their own fleet and provide customers ultimately with a really nice customer experience. And so that led us to listing on the ASX in 21. We're in the middle of lockdown in September in Sydney, and the company listed onto the ASX.
Nice, awesome. And how did you find that, I guess, the pandemic impacted the business? Did you get more business as a result?
Yeah, I mean, for us it was quite a positive thing because we're in logistics. A lot of people were working from home. And so there was a lot of increased volume across our Zoom to You network, and then interest in our Locate to You business. So yeah, it was a really positive thing for the business. Very busy, and dealing with really increased demands quite suddenly, and so a lot of logistical challenges. But yeah, it was a really good time for the business.
Yeah, I can only imagine. I mean, exciting, but also challenging at the same time.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I'm curious to know your journey into Bitcoin. When did you first start even considering the idea of potentially adding some Bitcoin to your balance sheet?
I sort of myself got introduced to Bitcoin around sort of 2017, and started buying sort of personally. And at that point, I sort of didn't really sort of understand exactly what I was buying. And then as sort of time went on, I started to understand, what is money, and then what Bitcoin actually meant. And then I started looking at sort of companies like Strategy in the US, and seeing what they were doing, and then looking at like Metaplanet. And then I'm like, well, I've got an Australian company that's listed. I could be doing the exact same thing. And so it was the middle of last year that I decided to then present this concept to the board, and that was the start of the journey.
Sounds so exciting. I would love to know how the conversation with the board went.
Look, it was interesting because I didn't warn anyone that I was going to do this, and I don't even think I realized what I was getting myself into. I sort of thought, well, I was so convinced on the Bitcoin strategy and the strategy of coming in and doing it inside of our company, and I thought, everyone would be on the same page, and generally they were, but it required a lot of going back to the basics, and I always find sort of going back and saying, okay, well, what is money, and what do we believe that money is today, and is it the physical $10 note that we walk around with, or is it something else? And then when you start that conversation, it starts people sort of, well, I've never thought about that. I've just always thought about the money as the money that that we have in the note, or the money that sits in our bank account. And then you start questioning, well, how much of that money is actually sitting in the bank, and all those types of questions around what actually is money. And then that then goes into, okay, well, this is what Bitcoin is, and these are the features of Bitcoin, and how does that relate? And yeah, I found that process was very useful, and for them to sort of start to get their head around it. And and ultimately the board was very supportive of this change to the business. And I guess the first stage was, go out and speak to some existing investors and some of our larger investors and see what sort of reaction we'll get. And that was an interesting process. And then go to the ASX and talk to the ASX around, this is what we're planning on doing, and see what their reaction was going to be to doing that.
So yeah, it sounds like quite a long journey to get there. And what I love about it is that you basically had to like build this story and narrative from the ground up. Like you said, starting with the basics, what is money, zooming out, understanding the entire history of money, what got us here today and where are we potentially headed. So it's very interesting to hear that. So out of the board, the investors, and the third group was
the ASX.
Yes. Who would you say was the hardest one to sort of win over or to convince?
Yeah, look, probably there were some investors which were like, I don't understand this, Steve, and I don't understand Bitcoin, but I really back you and trust your guidance on this. There was one or two investors who, had, didn't really understand Bitcoin, or didn't have any understanding of Bitcoin, and were really against this particular strategy. And in fact, I had one investor who was very, very disgruntled about this particular strategy. And I think most of that came from fear of not understanding. And Bitcoin is a complex topic, because there's a bunch of technology that you've got to understand about it, and then you've also got to understand existing monetary policies and how that actually works. And so it's not something that you can necessarily pick up in a relatively short period of time. And so over time, I think it was just continuing those conversations and not just having one conversation, having multiple conversations, and sort of getting them up to speed, and answering the questions that they might have, or concerns that they might have, as to, what does this mean, and what does this mean to the existing business? Are we forgetting about what we're currently building? And sort of reiterating, no, this is complementary to what we're actually building as part of our core business, and a really good way of being able to capitalize the business into the future.
Yeah, I love that story. And is there a particular sort of individual that went from like zero to hero when it comes to Bitcoin that you were like really pleasantly surprised with?
Yeah, I mean, I think all of those investors who were sort of concerned or anti it, have now come along and spent a lot of time themselves getting up to speed and turned around. And so, there's no investor today that is on our register today that's anti this what we're actually doing. I think they're all very supportive, and and I think see that there's a really good future in what we're doing in building a Bitcoin Treasury business in the Australian and now the New Zealand market.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. And last time I checked, which was a while ago now, was you had about 10 Bitcoin, about...
Correct. Yeah, so we've got about 12 now.
Oh, wow.
So we added a couple more recently, but
Nice.
we've got 12 on the balance sheet.
Lovely. And I saw that recently as well, you traveled to New York. I want to hear a little bit more about that trip, because I saw some photos coming up on Twitter of like Michael Saylor sitting in front of you. Did you
That's
get a chance to speak to him?
No, unfortunately, I didn't get a chance to speak with him, but I got to listen to him speak throughout the day, and just hearing, I guess, his insights into what he's been building inside of strategy, and how they're going through the building of their credit products, and what's taken to do that. And so it was a really interesting day, but I think what was also quite cool to see was that him sitting in the crowd and listening to other people speak as well. He just didn't sit in the background, but he actually came and sat, and you saw in that photo he was sitting a few steps in front of me.
Yeah. And just for context, what was the actual event?
So it was a Bitcoin Treasury conference.
Oh, nice.
And yeah, it was all around people there were Bitcoin Treasury businesses. And so you had a range of people from, founders and CEOs of Bitcoin Treasury businesses, investors, but also suppliers to Bitcoin Treasury businesses. So custodians, exchanges, those types of people.
Nice, nice. And was it also like a mixture of private and public sector as well, or?
Mostly, I mean, I guess most of the companies that were there from Bitcoin Treasury were mostly public companies. There was one or two that were private and then moving into the public markets, but yeah, I guess mostly in that public market space.
Nice, nice. And was there like an industry that dominated the room? I would assume it's always tech, but maybe I could be surprised.
Nah, look, I think yeah, most of these companies were all, I guess, tech based companies.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And I want to get into a little bit about the move to New Zealand. So recently, you guys have announced that you'll be moving to the New Zealand Stock Exchange. What is kind of the timeline on that and some of the reasons behind it?
Yeah, so I guess when we started this process, which was January this year, we announced to the market that we adopted a new Treasury policy and that was going to include Bitcoin into our balance sheet. And we'd spoken to the ASX around this is what we were planning on doing. And we didn't get any sort of negative sort of feedback from them or anything that, we should have been concerned about. And then we started the process of buying Bitcoin, and suddenly they started asking a lot of questions. And had some concerns around us continuing to buy Bitcoin on our balance sheet. And ultimately that led to the ASX didn't have any guidance around this. And during that process, then they started to develop some guidance, and then started to look at some of the existing rules that existed on the ASX and how they interacted with companies that were holding Bitcoin on their balance sheet. And ultimately, one of the rules that was going to impact us into the future was a rule called the cash box rule. I think it was designed in the 1980s, and it's essentially designed for companies to not hold large amounts of cash on their balance sheet, or just to be a shell that holds large amounts of cash. And yeah, we were going to, if we kept on buying Bitcoin into the future, we would be breaching this particular rule. And so that means that more than 50% of your company's assets were being held in cash or cash alike, and they were deeming Bitcoin to be cash alike. And so, yeah, that was their interpretation. And yeah, that wasn't really much that we could do to continue to be able to keep on buying Bitcoin on our balance sheet. And yeah, I guess our strategy is to keep on buying Bitcoin. We see that it's a great store of wealth into the future, and highly likely going to be the currency of the world in the future. And so we want to build our balance sheet with large amounts of Bitcoin, and that simply is just not possible on the ASX based on the current rules. And so yeah, that then led to me suddenly going, okay, well, I still want to do this, but I've got to find a solution, and trying to figure out what that best solution was going to be. And we went around looking at different exchanges around the world. Majority of exchanges, in fact, I didn't find another exchange that had this same cash box rule. So the cash box rule only existed on the ASX and didn't exist on all these other exchanges. And so there was numerous exchanges that we could have moved to. And then it came back to, okay, which exchange is going to be the quickest for us to actually move to and the easiest process to go through. And it's a complicated process. There's a lot of moving parts to it. There's a lot to do it. And our goal was to, how do we get listed in a new market and can start continuing to actually buy Bitcoin as quickly as we possibly can. And so we're still going through that regulatory approval process. There's a number of steps that we need to go through. But yeah, I would expect that in the coming weeks or months ahead, we should be listed on the NZX. And so we'll list as a fresh new IPO, subject to all the regulatory approvals, and we'll have a PDS, and so and then we'll then be in the ability to start being able to raise capital and buy more Bitcoin as a New Zealand business. And then they have this process called a scheme of arrangements, and so that will enable us to move all the existing shareholders and be able to take their shares and move them into the New Zealand entity, and essentially where they have shares in the New Zealand company. And that will probably take us through to the end of November, early December, until that process actually completes. So lots of fun legal work, and so my CFO is ridiculously busy at the moment, and as are all the lawyers working on the transaction.
Yeah, I can only imagine. And like as part of that assessment that you did for moving to, I guess, a different country or a different jurisdiction, did you also have to look at like, I guess, adjacent regulations in terms of how you might be impacted in purchasing in that particular country? Or I don't know what else might fall under, but I just feel like every country has very different regulations, and Australia and New Zealand seem to be particularly behind the curve, obviously compared to the US. I had
Yeah.
no idea as well. I was very curious to ask you what the other stock exchanges around the world do. I was very surprised to hear that that cash rule is particularly like quite unique to Australia. Is it
Yeah.
because of Bitcoin's liquidity that they're deeming it like a cash-like asset?
Correct. Yeah, and so that was one of their comments that actually made to me, was around, they deem that Bitcoin is a liquid market. You can convert that into cash fairly easily, which I agree
The
with.
easiest.
Yeah, exactly. And you can do that, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Yeah, so on that basis, yeah, I definitely agreed that was the case. And I just think it's an unusual rule, and it's probably a fairly silly rule. But yeah, and I guess, I think as being a regulator, you've got a tough job. Technology moves and changes. The ASX are going through a number of different changes, and this was just like another headache that they were having to sort of think about and deal with on the fly. And Bitcoin is a complex topic, and so I think sometimes it's often easier for a regulator just to say no, rather than actually spending time to actually understand it and then going, what does this actually mean, and what does this mean for the country? What does this mean for investors? And what's the risk to investors, and how does this compare to other risks that investors might be having on other investments that they might be making on the ASX?
Yep. Yeah, I'm very interested as well to know, I guess you probably won't know the answer to this because it might be more like internal information, but I'm curious as to why that rule would be there in the first place. Even Bitcoin aside, if it's why, yeah, I'm just curious.
Yeah, I think this is a rule that's been there for a long time. And again, I think it's quite difficult in regulated environments. Rules get added all the time, and that point in time might have had a particular purpose, but then no one actually goes back and removes the rules if they're no longer required. And so to remove a rule, I think, requires a group of people inside of an organisation or business to then go, hey, why is this here? Does this make sense today? What was this rule designed to stop? And I think the rule was originally designed to stop SPACs, so special purpose vehicles just being created, which just had cash in them and cash only. And so I think that was the main sort of purpose originally. But yeah, in this instance here, something new has happened. There's a new technology available. There's a new form of money that's been built, and there's a reason why a company wants to hold large amounts of Bitcoin. And so does that mean that rule should apply to this type of company? That's the big question.
Yeah. Yeah, and I wonder as well what the risks are. Like, forgive my ignorance, I should probably know this, but I don't. Like, so how would the ASX generate income in the first place? Like, what is their source of money?
Yeah, so companies like ourselves, so any company that's listed, pays listing fees. And so, yeah, they generate money from companies. There used to be over 2,000 companies listed on the ASX. There's been a number of companies that have delisted over the last few years. And so it's becoming more and more challenging for smaller companies to actually be listed on the ASX. And so I think that number's fallen down to about 1,900. And yeah, I mean, every company, depending on the size, is spending a reasonable amount of money to be listed. And I imagine they would also earn income through as stock is traded, I imagine they collect fees along that way as well. I'm not entirely sure, but definitely from listing fees of companies being listed.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm just kind of trying to think ahead now. The motivating factor for them to change this policy might be potentially more Australian companies being interested in holding Bitcoin, and as a result, having to go to New Zealand and other jurisdictions in order to make that happen. But have you heard from anyone else, any of your colleagues in the industry, that they're interested in doing the same? I remember last year when you actually listed, I found you and I commented on your LinkedIn post where you made the announcement. You're like, I think we're the first. I'm like, you're definitely the first.
Yeah. Look, I haven't seen of anyone else doing what we're doing, and I think we'll be the first company that's moved from the ASX to the NZX ever.
Right. Yep.
Usually, companies actually go the other way; they migrate from the NZX to the ASX. So we're doing the opposite, and so I think it's a big deal for the NZX to see that occurring, and will others follow? Yeah, I'm curious as to see. It's not a simple transition, and so it really requires a lot of commitment to this strategy. It's expensive to move, and there's a lot of work involved in doing it, and quite distracting. But yeah, whenever I'm doing it and I've got a strategy, I'm thinking about, okay, it's not just for the next year, it's for the next 10 years or 20 years, and so taking a long-term view. And I think this makes sense for our business over the long term.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It is a long-term asset so that you're holding. But now I'm curious to know a little bit about your personal story. So I think I read somewhere as well that, previously to, when you first got into Bitcoin, that you were also quite interested in Ethereum as well. And then you kind of, at some point in your journey, decided that, Bitcoin's kind of the real deal and you're going to do much better if you just focus on that single asset. Is that kind of what I read, or am I just making things up here?
I think at the time, back in 2017, sort of I bought some Bitcoin. I also bought some Ethereum, and I really didn't know what I was buying at that point. I sort of had an idea, and then I sort of just been holding both of them. I was, overweight, like a much higher portion of Bitcoin and a small percentage of Ethereum. And then as my sort of knowledge became a lot more in depth around Bitcoin, then I was like, well, yeah, I don't need to hold Ethereum anymore, and sold out of Ethereum and put that money back into Bitcoin. But yeah, so generally always have been much higher in Bitcoin. But yeah, I had a little bit of Ethereum, and then thought, it's time to actually sell it and move that money into Bitcoin.
Yep, yep. And do you remember what your moment was when as you were learning about Bitcoin, that you felt like, I really get it, this is something quite special? What was your light bulb moment? I had a few.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I think when you go from having Bitcoin on an exchange and then moving it to a cold storage wallet, and understanding the seed phrase and how that can be set up and how you can secure it. And suddenly I'm like, holy shit, I'm my own bank. That is a pretty interesting concept, and that you can travel across the world and take that with you. And then as you start going down that rabbit hole of thinking about, okay, well, what's made up of the money that's sitting in the bank today, and how that can, there's only a very small percentage of everyone's money actually sitting inside of the bank. And the fact that money can be printed so easily. And I remember back, just as before COVID sort of really took place, it was sort of in January, towards the end of January, I started seeing, I guess, what was happening in China. I was seeing they were building all these hospitals. I'm like, this is going to hit everywhere in the world. And I started thinking about that from an investment point of view, and what does that mean to my portfolio? And so at the time, I actually liquidated my portfolio into cash. I maintained my Bitcoin position, but only the equities that I was holding, I just put that into cash. And so then the stock market crashed, and I was like, great, I made this really great decision. And then suddenly the stock market started to rally, and I was like, well, this doesn't make sense. Why is this happening? And it was happening because all this money was being printed, and governments were producing huge amounts of capital into the markets to essentially create this false economy that was happening in the stock market, and assets were all being inflated. And so, yeah, then it gets you thinking, okay, well, how does this all end? And then what does that look like? And the debt keeps on growing in the US. And yeah, it always comes back to Bitcoin as being a really safe place to be holding your money.
Yeah, yeah, and I've started paying attention a little bit as to like the adoption metrics in countries where you experience hyperinflation or some political disturbance,
Correct.
and just how fast the adoption in that particular country takes off is absolutely like crazy. And
Yeah.
so now, whenever hear something on the news, I'm like, oh, yep, another country's just going to adopt Bitcoin. Like,
Yeah,
most
correct.
recently with Vietnam closing all those bank accounts, like something like 86 million bank accounts closed
Yeah,
because they didn't want to do the biometric. That's a huge selling point for
yeah,
Bitcoin.
that's right. That's right.
And yeah, I can just imagine the next wave will happen in Vietnam because of that.
Correct.
So yeah, it's very, very exciting. But I wanted to ask you, sorry, I've just lost my train of thought because I
All
get very
right.
excited. So in terms of your future planning for Locate Technologies, you're just going to focus on Bitcoin for the near to long-term future?
Yeah, I mean, so we'll continue to keep operating our existing businesses, both the two logistics businesses. But in terms of our treasury, it's only going to be Bitcoin. It'll only ever be Bitcoin. And so the goal is to increase our Bitcoin holdings. Eventually, once we have a certain size Bitcoin balance sheet, then we'll start thinking about offering some debt products. And so, yeah, we'll have that debt being backed by Bitcoin holdings into the future. And that is essentially, I guess, one of the great things about having a company, which is different to an individual, is that you're able to take your company's assets and then get some debt on top of that, and using the fiat currency to put that into buying more Bitcoin, which is a great way of being able to getting leverage inside of a Bitcoin position. Very different to an individual taking on sort of margin type debt, and if the Bitcoin price fluctuates, you get a margin call, and yeah, it becomes that we won't be doing. But where you can actually take some long-term debt type products and putting that into Bitcoin makes a lot of sense for a company.
Yeah, for sure. Like I'm thinking I need to start a company for this reason.
Yeah.
But I'm also curious to know, so is Locate the logistics side of the business? Are you also operating in New Zealand, or are you just literally taking?
Yeah, so our Zoom to You business, just as in the Australian market, the Locate to You product, that's our software product. We sell that globally. And so we've got customers in New Zealand, in the US, and throughout Europe and the UK. And so, yeah, we see there's a big opportunity to keep expanding on that. And in fact, I guess this whole Bitcoin strategy has enabled us to get a lot more media attention around what we're doing, and that then has resulted in more people knowing about our business, and will hopefully lead to more customers as well, that we can keep building the business.
Yeah, awesome. And I also read on Twitter, I get this where I get my news from, that you'll be doing another podcast with someone from your board. I want to say Matt is his name?
Mike.
Mike,
Yes.
close. Yep. And
Yeah.
is Mike one of the people who's also been recently orange pilled? Or
Yeah, look, I mean, he's been owning Bitcoin for some time now,
yeah,
and so I think it was something that he already understood when I came and pitched to the board, and I think had some Bitcoin himself, but then looking at how we did this inside of the company, and so quite supportive on the strategy. So that should be good. I think we're doing that tomorrow.
nice. Yeah, I'm gonna watch that. That's going to be awesome. It's really nice. It's really nice to sort of see these changes slowly starting to, grow in Australia and take root and turn into something
Yeah,
more
definitely.
serious.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
Yeah. But what is your experience in just speaking to kind of the general public? Do you feel that sentiment overall is changing in Australia, or is it still, you think we're still a little bit where it's treated like, that's different?
I think sort of last year when I started speaking to people, it was definitely like, why? What are you doing? And a lot of people didn't know about it. Today, when I speak to people, I think they're like, okay, they're like, that's interesting. And so they're not like, you're crazy. They're like, okay, that's interesting. But then there's a real lack of knowledge. And, just there's people that may have an opinion about it, but actually may not necessarily understand it. And so you see that happening quite often. And then, things like, well, there's only 21 million Bitcoin that can ever be created, and understanding, what does that actually mean? And then knowing that today's currency isn't backed by gold and it used to be backed by gold. And so, so I think there's still a lot of knowledge to be gained by a lot of people. And I'd say there's a very small percentage of the overall population that's actually understands it today. And that's actually probably part of the opportunity. Because if everyone understood it and understood how the banking system worked today, then Bitcoin would be much, much higher than where it is today. And so I think there's certain world events that actually occur that actually does increase the price in Bitcoin, because suddenly people are like, actually, what's happened in Thailand has meant there's real value in owning Bitcoin, because it can't be controlled by a government, and you can't just have it turned off like that. And so it gives control back to the individual. And so I think that's going to continue to keep on happening, and there'll be a point in time where the curve of increase adoption is just going to increase dramatically, and then there'll be a lot more people sort of rushing towards owning more Bitcoin.
Start saving in Bitcoin with Bitaroo, Australia's biggest Bitcoin-only exchange. Bitaroo offers easy tools and advanced features. Join thousands of happy users making their first Bitcoin purchase today. Download the app or visit bitaroo.com.au. Yeah, and I'm also curious to know, I don't know if you've made this information public or if it is allowed to be public. I'm just going to ask it anyway. But do you own Bitcoin, or do you own like Bitcoin through an ETF?
No, so we own it directly, and then we hold the Bitcoin. We've got an institutional grade custodian.
Nice.
And so I mean, one of the things we were originally looking at was, how best do we hold it, and cold storage wallets. I didn't want to leave it on an exchange, but being a public company and you've got to go through an audit process, it needed to be on an institutional grade custodian. And so currently we're using Zodia, so Zodia is one of the larger custodians backed by Standard Chartered Bank and NAB Bank. But ultimately, as our Bitcoin holding starts to grow, we'll end up having multiple custodians. And so looking for multiple institutional grade custodians to mitigate any potential risks between any of those custodians.
Yeah, it makes sense. And this is what I love about Bitcoin. Like, you can just always continue going down the rabbit hole of how do you de-risk? How do you take that decentralization mindset in all other areas of your life? Like, for example, me with banking, I've started like banking with multiple banks to see whichever one's the easiest one to move money in, onto an exchange.
Yes.
Have you had any issues with that, or is it a little bit different for companies transferring money?
Yeah, like it was, we certainly had some initially sort of figuring out how best we were going to be able to do that, because, certain banks have certain restrictions in the amount of money that you can. But once you move into an institutional grade acquirer of Bitcoin, then it becomes a bit easier. And so then you can actually move large amounts of money to be able to do that. And so, we've now got that set up and that structure sort of put in place to be able to do that, and makes it quite easy to be able to buy more Bitcoin and continue to keep on doing that once we're in New Zealand.
Yeah, awesome. I would be curious to know, because one of the things I always have in the back of my mind is thinking of my past employers, and I'm quite good friends still with a lot of people that I used to work with, and a lot of them are in CFO roles and not necessarily for public companies, but I'm thinking, how do I slip them a book? How do I get a conversation started and be like, hey, just, open your mind to this? But do you have any sort of advice for people who are currently in a business, why they should potentially consider having, even if it's like a single digit allocation to Bitcoin?
Yeah. I mean, I think it still always comes back to what is money, and just actually understand that in a lot of detail. And you know, you can use something like ChatGPT to actually help you pull together a presentation that actually understands, to help you understand better what money is, and going back to the gold standard when that existed, when that stopped existing, and then, okay, draw me a graph that shows me the cost of the loaf of bread from that time to today, and how did that actually increase? And then you put in, say, build me a graph that shows me the US debt from, you know, when the gold standard was lost to today, and you see how that's actually increasing and growing. And you're like, okay, so how does this ever get fixed? No one's ever been able to answer that question as to how the US debt is ever going to be fixed, and that's because it can't. Like, there's just no ways that they can fix it. And so the only way that they can fix it is probably, you know, the US government buying large amounts of Bitcoin, and seeing, you know, that's and, you know, if the US debt's going to keep increasing, which it will, owning Bitcoin is going to, you know, is going to be really, really important, because the US debt is just, the US dollar is just going to keep on being devalued. And so when you go to the supermarket, everything will just continue to keep on costing a lot more money than what it has previously. And, you know, even, you know, traveling in the US and just seeing the cost of things in the US as an Australian, taking Aussie dollars into the US, it is ridiculously expensive. And you know, you're going into the supermarket and even just buying a bottle of water, and that's, you know, the $5 or $6 for a bottle of water, and you're like, okay, now put that into Aussie dollar terms. It's just, yeah, it's insane. And the same going to restaurants. Like, you're spending the same in US dollar terms in the US, and it's like an $80 meal, but you convert that into Aussie dollars, and it's enormous. And so that's the devaluation of currencies that are occurring because governments are printing money. And yeah, I just don't see that changing. And so the way that an individual can protect themselves against that is by holding Bitcoin. And so doing whatever you possibly can to hold as much Bitcoin as you possibly can today. And yeah, it's often, I guess, people think about holding Bitcoin as like, you know, it's volatile, it's really scary, but I think actually holding fiat currency is going to become more of an issue for an individual, and is actually the bigger risk is actually holding the fiat currency rather than holding Bitcoin.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of people, particularly since COVID, because there's just been massive money printing worldwide in every country since then to deal with it, has really opened up people's minds to how easy it is to devalue the local currency. And
Right.
we never know what kind of a catastrophic event, you know, is around the corner and what might happen that will again trigger this off, and will be in an even worse situation than we are today. And,
Right.
you know, in countries like the US, you look at that Fred data of like the money printing, just how it's gone up exponentially. And we're talking about like trillions of dollars being printed pretty much like every day. It just feels like it's not something to be taken lightly. And even though it's happening in the US, the fact that they have a global reserve currency, the fact that they have the most powerful central bank in the world, it does have an impact on every other country in the world. Like, and yes, countries such as like Australia that have a stronger currency are less impacted than countries that have a weaker currency, but it still comes with huge impacts. And
Yeah.
and as part of like your risk assessment, do you look at that as well? Like, what is the US doing?
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely. Yeah, and it's sort of like there's this invisible tax that's occurring. You don't realize that it's actually happening. No one knows about it, but I guess the governments are making these decisions to essentially devalue the currency. And when you're going to the shops, you know, your same salary is not buying you the same amount of money, listen, the same amount of produce. And so that's I think a really big impact. And that's why Bitcoin is such a good thing, because it solves a lot of these problems.
Yeah, and I'm continuing to be shocked by inflation in Australia. Just almost every day I go and purchase something, and I'm just in absolute shock as to how fast and how high the prices of things have increased. Like, I went, just got a little cream from Priceline, I'm thinking, oh, this is probably going to cost around $12.95. It was $30.
Yeah.
And I'm sure it costs less than $2 to make.
Yeah.
my coffee as well. I purchased coffee on the weekend and it was $6.60 because it had a 10% surcharge. So I'm like, that's nearly $7 for a coffee. Like I remember when it was $2.50 or
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
$3 to get a flat white. Not anymore. Like
No.
it's just it's out of control. And I love, like, one of the questions that I love asking people to get them to think about fiat currency is when Australia went from the pound to the dollar in 1966. Since then, the Australian dollar has lost 94.5% of its value. So $1 from 1966 would be worth 6 cents in this year, like today,
Yeah, right.
which is absolutely crazy to think about. So, I think I read in Lawrence's book, or maybe I can't remember. I've got so many Bitcoin books going on at the same time. But if you found like a chest of cash from, your grandfather, it wouldn't be worth what you
No,
what you think
that's right.
it is worth today. And it's
Right.
like
Exactly right.
it's so disheartening, and it's particularly sad how many people don't know this and are surprised, like you mentioned before, to even learn that the dollar is no longer pegged to gold. It's
Right.
completely
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
separate. So
Yeah. And I
there's a
think,
huge education.
yeah, it's
Sorry.
just been this gradual thing that's actually occurred, and it hasn't been. It's not obvious to the individual what's actually happening. The only way it's obvious to them is when they go to the supermarket, but that's still, this gradual thing is like, gosh, that's becoming expensive, and then it's like, oh, that's a bit more expensive, and then yeah, so it's quite. I think it's quite a tricky thing for individuals to easily see.
Yeah, and it is very triggering for me as well to see sort of the government scapegoat supermarkets for prices. I'm like, kind
Yeah,
of like, not pointing to the root
yeah,
cause here, but not defending supermarkets. I'm sure they're not 100% innocent either, but like, I don't think the root cause lies in the supermarkets or just in general for the price increases everywhere. But yeah,
I guess you could maybe, I don't know, talking more a bit more about the Bitcoin Treasury companies and what we're seeing, what's happening at the moment. Maybe there's a bit of a downward trend in some of these companies,
yeah.
and there's also like why someone should buy a Bitcoin Treasury versus buying Bitcoin directly.
Yep, I would love to know that because this is something I don't know the answer to. So, what is even the difference?
Yeah, I mean, I guess if you've got the choice of buying Bitcoin and buying a Bitcoin Treasury business, and so owning Bitcoin means you own the Bitcoin directly yourself, and so I guess you've got the ability to buy through an exchange, and you're storing it hopefully in some sort of cold storage type environment. And so, yeah, a lot of people are doing that. But then you've also got the ability to buy like a Bitcoin ETF. And so that's where someone's wrapped up a financial instrument that's then has Bitcoin sitting in the background. And that's designed to make Bitcoin more accessible to people that don't have an account with an exchange. They don't want to go through the hassle of cold storage. And they probably just want some Bitcoin exposure inside of their portfolio, and they're probably not a Bitcoin maxi either. So if someone's told them that owning Bitcoin is a great idea, and just allocate 1 or 2% of your portfolio, or maybe it's 5% of your portfolio to Bitcoin, and doing it through an ETF, probably makes sense for people like that. And so then what's happened is you've got now, I guess, a Bitcoin Treasury business where the company might have an existing operating business, and in our instance, we do. We've got our Zoom to You and Locate to You business, and we're now saying, okay, we're also going to start allocating some of our excess cash, or we might raise capital to actually put that cash to work in buying more Bitcoin, and so that's different to owning Bitcoin directly. And what this allows is for someone who may not necessarily own Bitcoin directly, but they do want some sort of Bitcoin exposure inside of their portfolio. It makes it really easy for them to do that because they can just go to their traditional share trading portfolio and be able to buy our stock, and that gives them some exposure to Bitcoin. But where this becomes interesting is when a company like ourselves owns a reasonable amount of Bitcoin on our balance sheet, and then starts to add in leverage on top of that, and building some debt products allows us to essentially take the fiat currency out of the fiat world and then put that into Bitcoin. And then as our Bitcoin holdings start to grow in the future, because the value of Bitcoin we expect will continue to keep on growing, then that's allowing us to then to keep on continuing to take more fiat currency out of the fiat world and bringing that into the Bitcoin balance sheet. And so, these companies are a lot more volatile. Generally, they can have large swings, and so you have the ability to potentially outperform Bitcoin. But it may also overperform or underperform in terms of you might have some really heavy downward swings. And so you're seeing that at the market at the moment, where you've had a really big up run and a lot of these Bitcoin Treasury businesses, and then suddenly there's been an enormous correction. And so we'll see how, I feel like we're sort of at the bottom of that right now, and that should start to trend upwards, but you never know with what the markets do, and we'll see how that plays out.
Yeah, I've always found it interesting. Like, I don't necessarily I'm observing and watching what's happening in this space, but I don't necessarily understand it. Like, I don't necessarily understand why a company owning Bitcoin would outgrow Bitcoin, or why would, like, even on a downturn. Like, I don't understand, because in my mind I like things to be like one for one, but
Yeah.
that's not the case. And I'm like, what is that premium? Or, like, I don't know.
And so most companies today that are listed companies, they all trade at a forward-looking premium. So it might be that you've got a multiple of revenue that your business might be valued at, or it might be a multiple of earnings, so profitability of that business in the future. And so if you look at any of these large listed companies like Facebook, they all have very large multiples of those numbers. And so that's just common. That's how listed markets operate, and have been for many years. And so owning a company that has a certain amount of Bitcoin on their balance sheet today, if they're doing things to actually consistently keep on increasing that, then the market is basically pricing that in, but pricing that in ahead of the time of it actually happening. And so one of the metrics that people look at is the time to actually, it might be your company's valued at 2 times the value of your Bitcoin, or sometimes more. But how long does it take for that business to actually increase their Bitcoin holdings to actually get to that value? And so sometimes that might be 30 days, sometimes that might be a year, or it might be longer. And so it depends on the velocity of which that company can actually acquire more Bitcoin onto their balance sheet, and doing that through equity raises, but as well as some debt instruments to be able to do that. And so so it's a complex bit of work, and so it has the ability to outperform Bitcoin, but it also has the ability for people who are just wanting some Bitcoin exposure and are looking for a simple way to be able to do that. This allows them to do that. The other interesting thing is in certain markets across the world, there's different tax laws that apply based on owning Bitcoin directly versus owning an equity. And so,
Right.
So there can be some tax advantages in being able to do that, depending on where your local, where your tax residency actually is. And so in Japan, there's an advantage in actually owning an equity versus owning Bitcoin directly. And it looks like there's some advantages for New Zealand tax residents in owning an equity versus owning Bitcoin directly, from the tax that's payable on a gain that could occur. And so so when there's a range of different reasons as to why you would own a Bitcoin treasury, but sometimes it could be what's the most tax efficient way to actually be able to do that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So what would define a Bitcoin treasury? Is it merely a company that owns Bitcoin? Is that what
I
what
I
gives
think
it?
it's more than that, because you can very easily go and buy Bitcoin and put it on your balance sheet, but I think it's where those companies are consistently buying Bitcoin on a regular basis, and looking to do that, and looking for then ways to continually keep on maximizing the amount of Bitcoin that you're holding on your balance sheet. And so, yeah, there's obviously companies like Strategy and MetaPlanet that have been very successful and been able to do that.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, my personal bias is obviously owning Bitcoin directly. Like, I don't necessarily care about just the price exposure. I want to have a piece of like the scarcest asset ever created.
Yeah.
So that's, yeah, I'm definitely biased in that regard.
Yeah, and I think that makes sense for everyone to be able to do that. Yeah, and so I think that makes sense. This is potentially a way to be able to outperform that asset class, but time will tell whether that's the case or not, and so we'll see.
Yeah. And I'm very curious because you're a publicly listed company. Are there any restrictions in terms of what announcements you are and not allowed to make in advance? Like, are you allowed to disclose that are you going to purchase more Bitcoin, or is that something you can only say after the fact?
Yeah, so as a public company, generally you're only saying what you're going to do once it has actually been announced. And so we announced, I guess, to the market previously that this is our intention was to own Bitcoin on our balance sheet. And so when we buy Bitcoin, we would announce that to the market. So we're currently not buying any Bitcoin because of the ASX rule that we've come up against. So once we transition into the NZX, then we would start being able to buy Bitcoin again.
Yeah. Oh, you're not buying the dip. I remember everyone was celebrating 109. Like, it was a very welcome change. And this is what's so funny to me about Bitcoin is like our fear greed index is broken. It's broken. It's the inverse.
Yeah, that's right. But I think it's interesting because we view it when the price drops as like there's an opportunity to actually accumulate more. And that's because we've got a deep understanding of what actually it is that we own. Whereas an outsider looking in and saying, oh my God, like Bitcoin's just actually dropped a huge amount. And someone said to me the other day, but there was someone who had an enormous holding actually just sold a large amount of Bitcoin. That's really bad. And I'm like, well, actually, that's a really positive thing for the Bitcoin network, because suddenly, there's a person that's probably acquired a large amount of Bitcoin very, very early on. They were holding that, billions of dollars worth of Bitcoin. They've now sold it, and now that's actually been distributed against hundreds or thousands of people. And so it's going to make the overall network a lot more stable into the future, and that will reduce volatility as more people actually start to own the asset.
And I know a lot of people are also concerned about, centralization of distribution, that being heavily skewed towards, I guess, those early adopters. But I think it is a positive sign that, that people do have pressure to sell. Like, if you've been holding Bitcoin for 10 years, you want to reap the fruits of your conviction.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Yeah.
And I think, if you're holding, billions of dollars of Bitcoin that came from very little amounts of money, you want to be able to have the ability to spend that. And so, I think that's a positive thing for the network.
Yeah, absolutely. And will you be moving your business to New Zealand, like as in people and buildings?
We've got 2 new directors that have just joined us to the board in New Zealand. But we'll continue to keep operating our existing software business and locate and zoom to your business here in the Australian market. But I'll be spending a lot more time in New Zealand than what I previously had. And so getting quite used to that flight backwards and forwards between Sydney and Auckland.
I'm amazed that you're not jet lagged right now, or maybe you are. You just
the last 2 or 3 weeks, there's certainly been a lot of flying, and glad this week I'm sitting in front of my desk and I'm enjoying that.
I would be feeling very radioactive. Yeah. I'm curious to know, Steve, do you have any favorite models that you like to track or like when it comes to price, what's your personal sort of philosophy on where we're headed in Bitcoin? Do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I very much, I guess, have got a thesis on the reason as to why I think Bitcoin's going to increase into the future. And when and how that does that, I don't know, and I don't think anyone knows. And so I spend very little time thinking about that, other than I've bought it, and it's something that I'll revisit and look at in 10 to 20 years' time, and might sell a little bit at that point to do something with. But at this point in time, it's an asset to be held and not touched. And hopefully, it's an asset that continues on in generations into the future, and to be passed down. And so, so I think it's obviously a very good store of value. And so being able to hold that for the long term is really important. And don't get distracted with price movements in between. Lots of people talk about it, but I tend to not care or worry about it. It's bought and it's just going to sit there for a long time. And so I think it's often useful zooming out and not being too focused on the detailed day-to-day movements. And if you've got conviction in the asset, then just hold it and ignore the volatility in between, because that'll drive you crazy and quite distracting.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I only got into Bitcoin last year and we've pretty much everyone's saying, this is my first, I guess, bull run, and everyone's saying we've been chop-solidating for months. So as much as I'm not like price oriented, I kind of just want the experience of like yeehaw, like I just want the ride, and I don't care what it falls back to. Like I just want that experience of but I'm this is what happens every time I go on a tangent. I'd lose the question that I wanted to ask you. Like seriously, every time. Yes, I remembered. I remembered also that you sold your car for Bitcoin.
Yeah, and I think
Genius
that's like, like I guess once you have a really deep conviction in it, then you're like looking at everything that you're owning and going, how do I convert this into Bitcoin? And so, I had a very nice car, and decided that it made more sense holding it in Bitcoin than driving a fancy car. And I don't regret it. I enjoy driving that car, but I also enjoy not having it and just having a pretty normal car and seeing that money grow sitting in Bitcoin.
Yeah, exactly. Plus, you can buy that car back for a lot less, like for sats, in the future. But do you think like Bitcoin has sort of changed your spending habits and any sort of behavioral since you got into it?
I definitely think like it's definitely changed the way I would invest in the future. And so there's very few things that I would invest my money in other than Bitcoin. And in fact, the majority of my portfolio is Bitcoin and or my own company. And so that's where everything is, and it's against everything that a financial planner would tell you in terms of diversification. But I don't think diversification is necessarily a good thing. I think once you actually understand what you're actually owning and why you're owning it, you don't need diversification. And so that's my advice, my view on investing. And so I think it's just having conviction and real deep understanding of what you're actually investing in. And I think where lots of wealth has been created historically, it's not actually by having a diversified portfolio. It's actually where you've got real conviction in something and that thing has outperformed the market really well. And so obviously there's lots of risks associated with doing that. But I'm very comfortable in taking on that risk.
Yeah, well, it makes sense. The whole advice around diversification came from people who championed the debt-based system. So all of the products that they were diversifying against were all based around the same debt-based products. So, when you own something that's got a complete supply cap and predictable issuance schedule, then like why would you diversify?
Yeah,
Don't.
correct.
This is not financial advice, but
Correct. Exactly. Exactly.
yeah, I think Bitcoin's wonderful in that sense that everyone is updating and renegotiating what they think they know about money against this new asset. And
Yeah,
that's kind of
definitely.
the wonderful thing about it.
Definitely.
Before we close up, do you have any sort of final words that you want to leave with the audience?
Yeah, look, I think this is a really interesting time in history at the moment. I think Bitcoin's gone through this period of time where in the early days, it was a lot of like technical people that owned it. And now, you're getting to this point where there's institutional people, institutional investors that are now interested in it. And so I think with that Bitcoin will become more mainstream in the years ahead. And so I think this is definitely a very interesting and exciting time. And particularly, that's why you're seeing a lot of these Bitcoin treasury businesses coming about, because the mainstream is now wanting to be able to get some sort of Bitcoin exposure. And so, it's going to be an exciting years ahead as this starts to play out, and we'll see how the world transitions from the fiat world into the Bitcoin world.
Absolutely, absolutely. This reminds me of the chart by BlackRock's ETF launch, comparing it to gold. Like you just see, like,
Yeah, right. I haven't seen that chart. That would be a good chart to see.
oh yeah, it's like I'll send it to you as soon as we end this call. It's a really good chart. You just see adoption, like what Bitcoin took 12 months to do, it took gold ETF 5 years. Like,
Wow.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
No, it makes sense.
yeah.
Makes total sense.
Yeah. All right. Thanks for your time, Steve.
Thanks, Anja. Thanks for having me.
That's it for this week on The Honest Money Show. Big thanks to Bitteroo. Check out why more Aussies are choosing them at bitteroo.com.au. And shout out to our listeners on Fountain, where you can earn sats just by tuning in. If you appreciate the way we cut through the noise, you can support us directly via the QR code in the episode notes. Until next week, take care of yourself and your money.